Australia is being urged to do more to tackle climate change, with Fiji's Prime Minister revealing he has urged Anthony Albanese to go further for the Pacific region. The push comes as the leaders head into the final day of their Pacific Island Forum, where they will have frank, closed-doors discussions over climate change and regional security issues. Admiral Chris Barrie spent more than 4 decades in the Navy, including 4 years as Defence Force Chief. He's now an executive member of the Australian Security Climate Leaders Group and joins me now live. Admiral, thank you for joining us. I do want to touch on climate change in the Pacific, but first to some breaking news that we've had come into the newsroom this hour. The Prime Minister of the Solomon Islands has guaranteed that there will never be a Chinese military base in his country. Do you think Australia should take his word on that?
Well, I think we don't have much choice but to accept it at face value for the moment. But of course, some things change with time and one never quite knows what happens next. And I guess that underpins the rationale for using the honeymoon period with the new government in Australia to re-establish Australia's strong presence in the Pacific and show the leadership that the islands require.
It's been a big week in the Pacific. Anthony Albanese and Penny Wong have both remarked that Australia has been received more warmly there due to its upgraded climate targets. Have we done enough to restore trust that Australia considers climate policy a priority?
Well, I don't know that we would have restored trust in just a few weeks. I think trust takes a lot longer to establish. And of course, I think that's one of the failings of the past, that we rush into the Pacific, we do a job, and then we don't take much interest. I think an ongoing and strong relationship in the Pacific is what we would require, because if you stop and think about it, we are the big smoke as far as folks in the Pacific are concerned. They look to Australia for leadership. They look to us for being able to support them in every sensible way. And we should never forget that. We are the big smoke. And it is important that we play that role seriously. And I think the government's made good progress, but trust will take a lot longer to establish.
Penny Wong this week remarked that climate change is a greater threat to the Pacific region than aggression from China. Is that a fair assessment in your view?
Well, it depends how you measure these things. I'm on the record as saying that climate change represents an existential threat to humankind, including Australians, including people who live in the Pacific. The thing about climate change, as I look at it is inevitable if we don't do anything to head it off. And I'm afraid to say for my grandchildren, that's not the kind of future that I would want for them. So, yes, I do take it as a very serious national security threat. And it always start by saying, in terms of national security, it's security for Australians in Australia that we should be concerned about as much as we're concerned for the security of our friends and neighbours in the Pacific.
China is obviously looking to expand its presence in the Pacific. Does China's policies or lack thereof when it comes to climate change counter the role that it's trying to play in the region?
Well, it's very difficult to assess that. I remember the days when China was playing a very leading role in climate change in terms of research, and we know in recent news and information that they produce more solar panels than any other country on the planet. So in some senses, you can say, well, China's been up there. And of course, I'm not underplaying the difficulty of dealing with climate change in China. I think it is pretty hard in a country of nearly 1.5 billion people. But in terms of what we do in the Pacific, China's a lot further away than we are. We are still the big smoke. We are still the country that they look to for the leadership and the way ahead. And I think that's a really important role for us to play.
If current trends continue, would there be nations wiped off the map? Is this an existential threat to some nations?
Well, I think, again, we're hearing now, of course, some of those Pacific Island countries are in serious danger of being wiped off the map. And they are raising now issues with the United Nations Law of the Sea about what happens to our exclusive economic zones when our country disappears. And any potential income we might have got from fisheries and other measures would potentially evaporate too. This is becoming an urgent agenda for the United Nations to deal with, because it's really changing the fundamental base on which we did the law of the sea 30 years ago.
You have a significant military background. How significant is the military's contribution to climate change?
Well, we know from our allies and friends that they take it very seriously, and I'm sure that we're going to start taking it very seriously too. I think the inclusion of the climate minister now in the National Security Committee of the Cabinet is a very progressive step. I go back to saying my thoughts on existential threats and climate change require our militaries to be ever vigilant and present in the space. But I don't think it's going to be enough. I mean, we say in the Security Leaders Climate Group that one of the really important things that has to be done right now for Australia is a climate security risk assessment so we can have a framework on which we can build the initiatives we need to put in place. And that risk assessment has got to involve communities, and it's got to involve all levels of government, and it's got to involve experts both inside and outside government, because we need a comprehensive map from which to work. That's a very urgent task for the new government, I think.
Yeah, certainly a lot of work ahead. Just back on the Pacific, we're seeing two massive global powers competing in the region right now. What about the idea of neutrality in the Pacific, or maybe one? Is it they both seem to be antagonising each other? Is neutrality an option?
Look, that's pretty hard to say. I remember the days of the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone and all of the political stuff that was going on around that. But the really important point to be made here is decisions about the involvement of the great powers in the Pacific will be made in the Pacific Islands. They're not going to be made in Australia or New Zealand. They're going to be made in the Pacific Islands. And I think that's yet another reason why Australian leadership, leadership from New Zealand, countries like us, which they've got to feel more akin to, and we have a long history of being present in the Pacific Islands, so they do look to us. That's why we have to redouble our efforts to make sure, we're the first port of call. We're the first place they ought to come to. The days of when I spent going around the Pacific Islands, I know Australia was very warmly accepted as being a good friend for countries that were in need. And I think that comes back to this question of re-establishing the trust we once had and making sure we don't lose sight of the importance of the work we do there.
A fascinating discussion. Admiral Chris Barrie, thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, thank you.